So there was a lot of talk about India and Pakistan being on the verge of another war. What would happen? What would happen in the case of a serious war between India and Pakistan? Well, here is my prediction. If there is a serious war between India and Pakistan, the Hindu fanatics in India will use such a war to justify a genocide of the Muslim and Christian populations in India. They will say Pakistan is Muslim. We have millions of Muslims living in India. We cannot trust these Muslims because we are in a war with a Muslim country. And so therefore, these Muslims are a threat to India. Therefore, we have a right to exterminate them. And they will point to the Christians and they will say Christians want to convert Hindus to Christianity. Therefore, we have the right to genocide the Christians. This is how genocides work. The orchestrators of genocide will always look for a situation to use as a pretext to commit genocide. During World War II, the Germans used their war with the Soviets to justify exterminating the Jews. And during World War I, the Ottoman Empire used its war with the Russians to justify exterminating the Armenians. So, if there is a serious war between the Indians and the Pakistanis, the Hindu fanatics will make the argument that because India is in the middle of an existential war and is fighting for its very existence, therefore the Hindus have a right to exterminate all perceived enemies of India, the Hindu nation. And they will say the Christians want to convert Hindus to Christianity. They are a threat to the Hindu identity of India. And they will say we are in a war with a Muslim country and we have all these Muslims living in our midst. How can we trust them? And they will exterminate the Muslims and they will genocide the Christians. How do I know this? Well, look at the year 1947. If you want an idea as to how bloody it would be in a war between Hindus and Muslims, just look at the year 1947. My God, man. I have been reading about the violence that occurred between the Hindus and the Muslims in 1947. It was absolutely sadistic, cruel, barbaric, murderous. It was just bloodlust. 1 million people were butchered in the violence that broke out between Hindus and Muslims in 1947. The British left India, and before they left, they said, okay, we're going to give a country to the Muslim Indians, and we'll call it Pakistan. Here you go. And so you had all these Hindus who were living in what is now Pakistan, and you had all these Muslims who were living in India. And the Hindus in India said, okay, well, now is our chance to massacre the Muslims. And the Muslims in Pakistan said, okay, well, we have all these Hindus living in our Islamic country, our new Islamic country. Here is our chance to butcher the Hindus. And massive amounts of Hindus were trying to flee into India and vice versa. You had droves and droves of Muslims in India escaping to Pakistan, but on the way, many were butchered, robbed, raped, and 1 million people were butchered. And people on both sides will say that they were justified, and they will say, well, the Muslims were butchering the Hindus, and the Muslims will say that the Hindus were butchering the Muslims. But there is zero accountability. There is no accountability amongst the fanatics. And today, such arguments to justify such bloodshed are made. But I want to talk a little bit about what happened in 1947. And we are going to talk about two massacres that occurred in that very bloody year. We're going to talk about the Rawalpindi massacre in the Punjab region. And this massacre took place in March of 1947. And between 4,000 and 8,000 Hindus were butchered by Muslim mobs. And then there was the Jammu massacre. The Jammu massacre was partially a response, again, this was used as a pretext, but it was partially a response to the Rawalpindi massacre. And the Jammu massacre was very, very horrific. It took place in October and November of 1947. And from 20,000 to 100,000 Muslims were slaughtered by Hindus. And these Hindu fanatics pointed to the Rawalpindi massacre as a justification to commit their bloodshed. Again, all massacres, all genocides are done under a pretext. And so let's first look at the Rawalpindi massacre. So the Rawalpindi massacre was preceded by an election in the Punjab province in which the Muslim League was defeated by a coalition of parties in 1946. This was followed by the leader of the Muslim League, Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, calling for direct action in August of 1946. Direct action against whom? Against the Hindus. This call for direct action was followed by very violent riots. And there were major riots that occurred, and these riots took place in Calcutta. And the Muslim League called for Muslims to overthrow the government in Punjab because they were not happy with the election results. The Muslim Party, the Muslim League, was the biggest party, but it lost to a combination of parties, and so they were unhappy about the election results, and so they called for riots. And they were calling for the overthrow of the Punjabi government, and more riots followed in the northwest frontier province. Riots and violence broke out in the Rawalpindi division in northern Punjab, and the Muslim mobs were filled with fanaticism, bloodlust, and they went on a rampage. But the Hindus and the Sikhs defended themselves, and they said, we're not going to let these Muslims just rampage us and butcher us. So they fought against the Muslims, and the Muslims stood back and they said, okay, well, let's look for some easier targets. And so the Muslim mobs turned to the countryside. The Muslim mobs went on a horrific, harrowing rampage, murdering, looting, raping, village after village after village. For example, in the village of Kahuta, Muslim mobs set fire to the homes of Hindus and Sikhs, with the people still inside of them. And of course, women were abducted and raped. Now, the Muslims will say, well, Hindus were going to kill us, or they were killing us. This is what I don't understand. Anytime you have these sorts of massacres being done, the people who orchestrate the massacres will try to justify it, and they'll say, well, we were in a war, or we were in a fight for our lives, or we were trying to defend ourselves. Then why rape? Okay, you're fighting terrorists. Why rape? What is rape a weapon? Is rape a self-defense weapon? This is how you know these people are just liars, and they will point to real problems as a way to justify their own bloodlust and their own evil desires. Here is another example of what happened in the Rawalpindi massacre. In the village of Beval, the people were asked to convert to Islam. One group of villagers said, okay, we'll convert to Islam, and the rest were mostly butchered. According to one survivor of the Beval village massacre, out of 500 Hindus and Sikhs, 76 survived. And out of that 76, half of those survivors were abducted. Similar atrocities were done in the villages of Mughal, Basili, Kalar, Dubheran, Jikigali, and Kuri. Yes, I wrote all this down because I can't remember all these details. Some survivors were found disfigured, and there were women who were found with their breasts cut off. Again, people will say, well, Hindus were against Muslim, but why cut the breasts out of women? Why rape women? Why abduct and rape women? What does this have to do with self-defense? It's like the Armenian genocide. The neo-Ottomans of today, the Turkish nationalists today will sit there and say, well, the Armenians were allied. They were allies with the Russians. We were in a war with the Russians. The Armenians were doing terrorist attacks against the Ottomans and against Muslim civilians. Okay, fine. You want to fight against terrorism? That's totally legitimate if you want to fight against terrorists. But why did the Turks rape countless Armenian women? Why did they massacre so many Armenian civilians? It's like this war in Gaza. The Israelis, again, this is another example of pointing to a real threat or pointing to terrorists as a pretext to justify mass murder. In the case of Gaza, the Israelis will say, well, we're here to fight terrorists. Okay, you want to fight terrorists, fine. Why are you shooting children? The New York Times published an article in which they showed x-rays from children, and you can see the bullets in the children's bodies, and you can see it on the x-rays. You can see, for example, there was one x-ray where you could see the bullet is inside of a child's skull. There's one where you could see the bullet is inside of a child's neck. Why are you sniping children if your war is against terrorists and if you're in a war on terror? It's because you're using the existence of terrorists as a pretext to justify your crimes, your mass murder. Here's another example of what happened in the Rawalpindi massacre. In the villages of the Gujar Khan and Kambelpur districts, dead bodies of children were discovered hanging from trees, and girls as young as 11 were gang raped. Again, what does this have to do with what? Self-defense, fighting for a cause. This is not a righteous cause. This is simply bloodlust and very, very sick and sadistic desires that are being done under the guise of some noble religious cause. And it's just all a bunch of bullshit. Entire villages were wiped out in the Rawalpindi massacre. From 4,000 or between 4,000 and 8,000 Hindus were butchered. Now let's talk about what the Hindus did to the Muslims in 1947. So there is the Jammu massacre of October to November of 1947. The massacre was preceded by a fight over whether or not the province of Jammu and Kashmir should be either independent or a part of Pakistan. The majority of the political parties, in fact, all major political parties in Jammu and Kashmir, wanted independence, but the Muslim Conference, which was the Islamic Party, demanded for Jammu and Kashmir to be under Pakistan. And so the Muslims did an uprising. They knew that the majority of the political parties in Jammu and Kashmir wanted independence. They wanted to be under Pakistan. And so the Muslims did an uprising and they wanted to overthrow the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, Mr. Hari Singh. The Maharaja was informed that there were about 400 Muslims who had infiltrated Jammu with the intention of terrorizing the Hindu population. So here we have a terrorist presence. Here we have the presence of Islamic terrorists in Jammu. And the Maharaja told Pakistan to control its terrorists and to prevent its terrorists from entering Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan was in fact planning on doing an invasion of Kashmir. And where did this massacre take place recently in India? It took place in Kashmir, because Kashmir is the territory that the Pakistanis and the Indians are laying claim over, and they want to go to war over this region. Well, back in 1947, it was still the same case, and the Pakistanis wanted Kashmir. They did not want the Hindus to control Kashmir, so they were planning on doing an invasion of Kashmir. Pakistan's Muslim League was sending its members into Jammu to train Muslim militants, and the Muslim Conference was stoking up the Muslim mobs against the Hindus under the guise of uniting the Islamic Ummah. So they said, okay, we have to unite the Muslims. Let's fight the Hindus. The Islamic militant leader, Pir of Manki Sharif, sent agents into Jammu to prepare people for a violent jihad. So there was a real presence, a real threat of Islamic terrorism in Jammu. So what happened? The Hindus used this reality as a way to justify mass murdering the Muslim population in Jammu. And on October 14th, members of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, which still exists today, and Sikh fanatics attacked Muslim villages in the Jammu district, murdering Muslims, looting and stealing and just robbing their properties and setting houses on fire. Again, what does this have to do with self-defense? Okay, so let's say you have Muslim terrorists in your country. Fight the Muslim terrorists, get rid of the Muslim terrorists, take them to justice. Why are you stealing people's property? Why are you lighting houses on fire? What does this have to do with fighting terrorists? Because they were using the threat of terrorism as a way to justify their desire for mass murder. The Hindu rioters were in fact armed by the provincial government. Rioters were moving in with vehicles. They were on their vehicles, driving through the streets, doing rampages. They were on a rampage. They had weapons. And there were these poor men and women whose job it was to transport milk, to deliver milk. And these men and women who were there just to deliver milk were slaughtered mercilessly by Hindu fanatics. The killing was so rampant that at the Ramnajar Reserve in Jammu, one could see scores of dead bodies of Gujar men, women, and children. It was utterly horrific. Muslims in Talab Katakan joined together to defend themselves. So some of the Muslims said, okay, we have to fight against these Hindus. And so in Talab Katakan, they got together and they said, we're going to fight. We got to fight. They were told to surrender. And they were told, if you surrender, we will allow you safe entry into Pakistan. They believed the Hindus, and thousands of Muslims were loaded into trucks. And when they reached the outskirts, they were taken out of those trucks and they were butchered by Sikhs and by members of the RSS. And of course, women were abducted, women were raped. And you could sit there and say, well, we Hindus were trying to defend ourselves. And so you defended yourself by raping? They used the presence of terrorism to justify mass murder and rape. The number of people killed in the Jammu massacre has been estimated to be from 20,000 to 80,000, but Ved Bhasin estimated the death count to be at around 100,000 people. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. And so this should give us an idea as to what would happen in a major war between Pakistan and India. The Hindu fanatics, the RSS, and the RSS organized the Jammu massacre. The RSS organized the Jammu massacre, and the RSS is still present in India today, and they are very influential, very powerful. They are a Hindu mafia. They are the militant branch of Narendra Modi's BJP party. And they want to massacre the Muslims and the Christians. But they can't do that now. They can't do a Holocaust of Muslims and Christians right now because it would just look, well, because they wouldn't be able to hide behind anything. They need a guise. They need something by which to masquerade their violence. And a war acts as a perfect guise under which to do a genocide. And so this is what would happen. They would say, we're in a war with Pakistan. We're in a war with Muslims. We have all these millions of Muslims in our midst. We cannot trust them. Therefore, we are justified to genocide them. And they will say the same thing about Christians. Well, it'll be different because Pakistan is not Christian, but they will say Christians are a threat to Hindus. Therefore, we have to get rid of them because Christians are they're out to convert Hindus into Christianity, and we must genocide the Christians. This is my prediction for what would happen in the case of a serious war between India and Pakistan. Now, why else do I say this? What's the other reason besides what happened in 1947? Well, the other reason why I say this is because this is how genocides are done. This is the nature of genocide. Genocides are not done they're not done in a way where the orchestrators of the genocide just get up in the morning and say, well, let's just have us a genocide. We just want to exterminate people. That is not that's not the strategy that is utilized to commit a genocide. What is done in genocides is the orchestrators of the genocide will use a catastrophe. They will use the presence of a war to say, well, we are in the middle of a war, and this said religious group or this said ethnic group are allied with the enemy, or they are members of the same religion or ethnic group as the enemy is. So therefore, we have a right to genocide this people. This is how the Holocaust was done. The Germans didn't begin the Holocaust until they were deep in their conflict with the Soviet Union. And they said, well, Karl Marx was Jewish, and a lot of the Bolsheviks were Jewish, so Jew became synonymous with communist. Jew became synonymous with Marxist partisan. And the Nazi policy was, if you find partisans in Eastern Europe, if you find partisans in the Soviet Union, there are Jews somewhere in their midst. There are Jews adjacent to them, find the Jews and butcher them. And so fighting the communists became synonymous with genociding the Jews. During World War I, the Ottomans were in a war with the Russians, and the Ottomans said that the Russians are using the Armenians as a proxy against the Ottoman Empire. The Russians want to create an independent Armenian state, and that would involve carving out an entire territory from the Ottoman Empire, thereby reducing the size of the Ottoman Empire. And because we are in the middle of a war with the Russians, and because so many Armenians are pro-Russia, therefore the Armenians are a threat to the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, we must exterminate the Armenians. And this is how the Armenian genocide was justified. There were Armenian militants who were fighting for an independent Armenian state. They are stories of Armenians butchering Muslim civilians. The Ottoman Empire pointed to these stories as a way to justify mass murdering the Armenians. The Israelis have been doing the same thing with the Palestinians. You had October the 7th, Palestinians who want an independent Palestinian state butchered Israeli civilians. What happened was a crime. What happened was terrible, not justifying it. The Israelis will point to this reality as a way to justify mass murdering Palestinians. And you can read stories about Israeli snipers murdering, shooting Palestinian civilians. The New York Times did an article in which they show X-ray images showing the skull of a child with a bullet lodged in his head. You can see an image of an X-ray of a child with a bullet in his body. Numerous pictures of this proving that Israeli snipers have murdered civilians. And all this has been done under the justification of fighting terrorism. It's a war on terror, therefore we are justified to do war crimes, to do massacres. Now, I've been reading this book on the Armenian genocide, and the writer of the book, Mr. Grigoris Balakian, was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. He was on the verge of death numerous times, and he talks about the arguments that the Ottomans provided when they were trying to justify the Armenian genocide. And he says that before the Armenian genocide, the secular Turkish government, the Ittihad government, that was ran by the Turkish nationalist Young Turks Party, made a warning to the Armenian population. And they said, Armenians, if you ever decide to revolt against us, we will genocide you. So, for example, Mr. Balakian, Grigoris Balakian, quotes an Ittihadist or Young Turk politician, in which he says, if the Armenian nation chooses to again resort to secret treachery like that which occurred during Sultan Hamid's reign by working against the new and free Ottoman regime with the goal of separation, then I declare that we Ittihadists shall punish such a betrayal with a severity to make you wish for the blackest days of the Sultan's tyranny. And believe it or not, this speech was done in a church. The Young Turks overthrew the Sultan. So you had Sultan Hamid II. He did he orchestrated horrific massacres of the Armenian population. And so the Young Turks took over, and the Young Turks promised to give rights to the Armenians. And that's why when the Young Turks overthrew the Sultan, the Armenians were very jubilant. They were very happy because they said, okay, look, we're going to be under a secular government. We're going to have rights. This is going to be great. And an Ittihadist or a Young Turk leader made a speech in a church after the overthrowing of the Sultan. And so here he is talking to Christians, and he's saying, oh, we love you Armenians. Armenians have been good to us. And here he is complimenting the Armenians. And then in the same speech, he says, but if you ever try to revolt against us, we will butcher you. Balakian goes on to quote another Ittihad politician by the name of Abdul Rashid. And Mr. Rashid said, if Europe attacks in order to wipe us out, then we will be forced to carry out such a plan of revenge against our subject Christian peoples, that the Europeans will be stupefied and unable to take even a single step against us. In other words, If the Europeans go to war with us, we will butcher the Armenians. We will have our justification, our pretext to butcher the Armenians. And so World War I breaks out, and the Ottomans are in the middle of a war with the Russians, and a lot of Armenians are pro-Russia. In fact, you had Armenians who were openly vocalizing their support for Russia. And so the Ottomans would point to this and say, you see, how can we trust these Christians? They are an enemy. We must exterminate them. And they proceeded to exterminate the Armenians. During the Holocaust, the Germans said, the Soviet Union is our existential enemy. And a lot of the Jews are communists. They are pro-Soviet. Therefore, we have a right to exterminate them. In 1947, you had Muslims who wanted to do terrorism in Kashmir and Jammu. And so the Hindu fanatics said, we have all these Muslims living in Jammu. We cannot trust them. Therefore, we have a right to exterminate them. So what would happen in the case of a serious war between Pakistan and India? Massacres will occur. And the Hindus will say, we are in a war with Pakistan, therefore we have a right to genocide the Muslims and the Christians. Those are my thoughts on that. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.